Kevin Corbett, and retired qualified nurse since 1986. I worked in medical and surgical nursing, community nursing, intensive care a little bit, coronary care, high dependency, infectious diseases nursing, some experience in forensic nursing, quite a wide range of clinical nursing experiences, and also as an academic in nurse education and health sciences research. Well, following the science is a very interesting mantra, really, that's been rolled out both in the United Kingdom and in America and other countries. And what's meant by that is following our science, following a certain form of science that has been officially approved. So when the British government talks about following the science, they mean following the Imperial College modelling and following the Drosten test, the science of the Drosten test, or the Corman-Drosten test, really. It's so full of problems, it's very difficult to know where to start, but I will start. I call it Lysenko science, like the Russian agricultural scientists in the 1930s in Russia that bastardized science and misdirected generations of agricultural science in Russia by going against Mendelian genetics and saying that genetics didn't exist, it was a wrong science, and that we need to follow a Russian form of science for agriculture. And it completely devastated the Russian economy, destroyed the agricultural science in Russia since the 1930s right to the 50s until it was disproved. And it was disproved because the Russian crops failed year after year after year. So often it became an embarrassment to the Russian government, and they realized that their science was a failure. It's similar to this. This PCR test and SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, is a misdirection of science. Now you can ask, why is science being misdirected? Is there an agenda there? That's another question, but it's a misdirection of science, undoubtedly, because we know this when so many scientists come out against the official narrative. You've got so many groups of scientists now. You have the Great Barrington Declaration, you have the Hart Group of Scientists. Everywhere you look, you've got affiliations and collections of scientists. Many of them agree that SARS-CoV-2 exists, but they don't agree with the application of that science to lockdown and to the social sphere and to the cessation of civil society that it's been used for. So the stopping of civil society, the suspension of our normal everyday activities due to a virus is questioned even by the scientists that believe that SARS-CoV-2 exists. Now, there's great questions over the existence of that virus that the official scientists and some of the distant scientists don't want to go near, which is to do with the fact that the initial test, the PCR test methodology, was based on a computer model virus. It was not based on a purified isolate from real patients, because China didn't have that. When they gave the data to the Corman-Drosten authors to model the virus, they didn't have a sequence that was developed from a pure isolate. So they hadn't taken blood from patients and isolated from that a particular virus. They had some elements of a genetic code, which they modeled in silico computer modeling to produce what they said was a complete sequence. And that was the basis for the PCR test that's now being used. So even if you believe that this is a purified virus, that it does exist, you know, its existential evidence is sound. Even if you believe that as a scientist, it's still true to say that the test was computer modeled from a computer model. It wasn't developed from a real piece of genetic material from a patient. That's true, and that's what they admitted in the paper in Neurosurveillance in January 2020, the Corman-Drosten et al. Paper, co-authored by United Kingdom's Professor Zambon from Imperial College London. She's the head virologist who runs the testing for Public Health England for SARS-CoV-2. They admitted that they developed the test based on in silico modeled genetic sequence, not a real element taken from patients. That's truth. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's the truth. Now, how they've dealt with that since is they've tried to purify the virus and to show that the outputs from the PCR cycles equates to isolate as a gold standard. But that doesn't work. They've not proved that either. So basically, there is no underpinning material basis for that modeled virus the test is based on. And that's why a lot of scientists do question the existence of SARS-CoV-2. They do question it. Now, COVID-19, the disease that SARS-CoV-2 is said to cause, so you've got a so-called virus causing a so-called disease, COVID-19. The case definition of COVID-19 is based on a positive PCR test. That's the definition of it. Plus or minus symptoms. 3 real generic symptoms that are always quoted is a high temperature, high fever, a cough, a dry cough, non-productive cough, and or olfactory symptoms like the loss of taste. These are very common symptoms in many different conditions, many different medical conditions, from colds, flus, etc. They're so generic as to be unbelievable to be collected into a medical diagnosis, a new medical diagnosis that's stuck together with a PCR positive test. And even with a PCR test and no symptoms, they'll classify you as a case, a COVID-19 case. It is so tenuous. It's ridiculous that this has happened. But the medical profession has been fed these protocols in the United Kingdom. They came from China. The protocols were put out by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, rubber stamped by NICE, which is meant to develop protocols within the UK based on evidence, not based on diktat from the WHO. And WHO, developed evidence. They're supposed to develop their own meta-reviews of the evidence. That's the job of NICE. They do meta-analysis of all the evidence, and they produce protocols that take years for any condition, not within weeks. These were put on the table from under the table. They were produced in weeks for NHS trusts, based on WHO information. So what that also shows is that the World Health Organization is running the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. The NHS is subservient to WHO expertise. The WHO is telling the NHS how to run the tests in the lab, what cycles to use. All this came from WHO. And the WHO, in its own document given to the NHS, and I got a copy of it from Maria Zambon herself, it said on one of the pages about diagnosis of SARS-CoV-2 should not be based on isolation of the virus. It said that. So it's telling the governments of the world, don't bother isolating it. Trust us, it's there. Well, they did trust the WHO, and, when 22 scientists looked at the PCR test, molecular biologists in the main. These are credible, hard scientists. They're not people that look at perceptions. They're not social scientists that look at people's views and understandings. They're hard lab scientists and clinicians, physicians, doctors, and molecular biologists. They found this in silico modeled virus to be very, very questionable in terms of its basis as a test, for its use as a test. So the test developed from that in silico modeling, they questioned the 15 major problems with the test, with the PCR test. And it's all online, that paper. That paper was rejected by Eurosurveillance. So Eurosurveillance wouldn't retract their initial paper on the PCR test, even though the rebuttal from the 22 scientists was very clear, and very supported internationally. So here we have a journal protecting its own reputation, protecting the patents that have gone with the Corman-Drosten test. Because we're talking about when a paper is retracted and the basis for a medical test is withdrawn scientifically, it means the patents should be suspended. So the income from those tests, the profits that are made from them, which are in the billions now, should also be suspended. And that's what this is about. This isn't about, the science. This is about power and it's about money. So the test is spurious. The diagnosis of COVID-19 is very generic. It's made really without much of a history being taken. People report these generic symptoms. They're given a label of COVID-19. Yeah? That's very spurious. And what's happened in hospitals is people's pre-existing diseases that have these symptoms have been recoded as COVID, right? What's happened in the general population is this. You put the fear out there, the fear of the virus, the fear of the disease, and the fear of death, and you rekindle that with the behavioral insight team in the government that developed all the imagery, all the advertising to go with COVID and SARS-CoV-2, which is all death-related. It's all about contracting something that's going to kill you. It's all fear-based. And you put that out in the public. So you create socially amongst the public this fear, this hysteria about the virus. And that's the bedrock. That's the ground on which you sow the seeds of the existence of the virus. So people are told this exists. They're told somebody's had it in their family. They know somebody's been given the diagnosis, so it must be real. Yeah? That's how it works. Social generation of disease, sociogenesis it's called in social science. This has happened before with other conditions. The Samon epidemic in Japan in the 1970s was due to an antidiarrheal drug. People were dying of this autoimmune disease. It was a killer. People really died. Hundreds of people died of it. But they didn't know that it was due to a marketed antidiarrheal drug. They even isolated a virus as the causation of it. So they isolated a virus for a condition that was due to a pharmaceutical drug. The SMON condition was like this very, very bizarre condition that people died of. Now, they very clearly thought they had a virus for this, and they're about to make a test and run it right across the Japanese population, when several scientists realized through looking at case data and looking at blood results, looking at real patients, that this was due to a drug that was on the market, not to a virus. So that's happened before, that science has been misdirected. So with the COVID-19, it's important that the public understands people get this diagnosis often through having very generic symptoms, having pre-existing diseases like COPD, asthma, chest conditions, heart conditions, all sorts of body system conditions that are already there, that are already diagnosed. And they have one of these symptoms, a cough, a high fever, a change in olfactory symptoms, and they're given the label of COVID-19. So it's a bastardization of what we call the differential diagnosis in medicine, where you get a history from the patient, a long history. You go back several years, you interview them. You don't just do a PCR test, and you don't just take 3 symptoms and diagnose something based on 3 symptoms. And that's why so many people have been given the label. Yeah. And once you give somebody a label, once a doctor or a nurse gives a patient a diagnosis, that label stays with them like a stigma. So they take on the identity of that condition. They have an affinity with it. Yeah. They've been given it. It explains the situation that they experience. And so it's very hard to disembed that in a population.